Basement of La Penta. This is WICR.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Sports Vault. This is a little bit different, kind of moving away from sports for a minute to talk about just a phenomenal documentary I saw the other day called Last Days in Vietnam, produced by PBS. It was terrific, and I've gone on the air a couple times to talk about Vietnam War history. I'm a big history buff in general, not just in sports, but U.S. history, war history, and I've tried to really find as many documentaries as possible as I could on the Vietnam War, and there are a lot of great ones out there, but let me tell you right now, this is one of the newer ones, and this was terrific. I mean, one of the best ones I've ever seen, and it's on a phase of the Vietnam War that I think doesn't have a ton of content on it. The final days, it really goes through the evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in the last, kind of like the title says, the last days in Vietnam, and everything that kind of happened in 1975, where the world was just kind of shifting and everything was happening. It's just fascinating because a lot of this footage is stuff that I don't know where they found, but it's amazing the angles they found. It was just the search they must have conducted to find some of this stuff is just incredible. It's about an hour and 40 minutes long. It is up on YouTube right now, so you can check it out, but it was just terrific. I mean, I think we kind of all understand it, especially for me. I mean, I didn't live in that time, but for a lot of people, it had to be a very tumultuous time and a very sad time because I think symbolically, with the loss of Vietnam and Saigon falling to the communists, it kind of symbolized that all of those lives that we sent there that were lost were kind of lost for nothing. We kind of just packed up and left. And what did those lives ultimately die for? I mean, the original goal for us to go there was so that South Vietnam could have their freedom, could have their independence, could function as an independent state. And that did not happen. So those 58,000 American lives, what did they die for? I think that's the saddest thing that you take away from all of this. And you'll see in this documentary, I mean, how hectic those final days, because the South Vietnamese, we don't talk about it a lot, but how much they helped Americans during that war. And a lot of this documentary focuses on those people in the final days, where it was evidently clear that the ARVN, and for people who don't know, the ARVN is the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam's military during that time. And just how many people who helped Americans were just trying to find any way they could to get out of the country, because there at that point when the North Vietnamese came and they were going to find the people who helped out the Americans, and they weren't going to be too kind to them. So it's just amazing to see just the footage of the embassy and how many people. I mean, there's a chapter in the documentary called just Desperate Eyes, and that just sums it up so well. You just look at the despair and desperation of these families and these people outside of the U.S. Embassy, just desperate to get out. I mean, holding up papers that they had to show that they'd helped Americans during the war. And I do give America credit, because we did get a lot of people out of there who did help us. But as they showed in the documentary, when you watch and see, there were a lot of people who did not get out. I believe at the end of the day, the U.S. Embassy ambassador was one of the last people to leave. He refused to leave until they could get as many South Vietnamese and other people who helped the U.S. as possible out. And there came a point where President Ford, who was the president at the time, just told him, you've got to get out of there. It was an official order. The U.S., the final helicopter out of Vietnam and pretty much sealing our exit from the war, was the ambassador and all remaining American personnel, which left about 400 South Vietnamese who helped us out to kind of just fend. They were just kind of left. I mean, they did evacuate a sizable number of people. I mean, they had an amazing testimony from one of the pilots who they were just flying back and forth all day from the embassy to the U.S. aircraft carriers, bringing people back and forth. The trip back and forth took about an hour, and these helicopters, which were called Chinooks, they're pretty sizable, carried about 50 people, and there had to be, I think they said at one point, about 2,000 South Vietnamese in the U.S. Embassy waiting for evacuation. So they got a lot out, but I think at the end of the day, they left about 400 there, and it was just it's amazing too, because they go through in this documentary what the U.S. plans were, because as soon as Ford came into office, and they say this, which is fascinating, the North Vietnamese, the communists, were terrified of President Nixon. They were terrified of him. They actually thought that if they did launch an offensive against the South again, he would bring back U.S. troops. So we did see when the U.S. signed a ceasefire, the Paris peace treaty, which basically said that the North Vietnamese and the South would have peace. There would be no fighting between them. It was basically a disarmament, a peace agreement. But as soon as they were terrified after that time, but once Nixon was out of office, they launched an offensive almost immediately. And that just shows you, I mean, for all the criticism Nixon got, to inspire that kind of fear was pretty impressive, that they would not launch an offensive because of his presence alone, and really believing he would send U.S. troops back. But they did launch the offensive, and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam just stood no chance without the aid of the United States government. And you just really see, I've done a lot of research on the ARVN and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and how they really function. And the bottom line is the U.S. improperly trained them this whole time, and the U.S. fully took over combat responsibilities in about 1967. The U.S. was bringing combat troops in starting in 1965, but they really brought in and started a heavy campaign in 1967. The main problem was the U.S. just tried to win the war by themselves. They did not properly train the ARVN to really handle what they would have to fight. The U.S. tried to fight this as a conventional war, which it never was. This was never an all-out conventional war. This was a war where you needed to just protect the borders. The U.S. they relied massively on body count to try to indicate if they were winning the war or not. It wasn't by land taken, it was about bodies that they could account for that they had killed, and that was not the right way to fight this war. They should have been training the ARVN all along to handle their ability to protect their country, because we did see, and this is the thing that always drives me crazy about the Vietnam War, is the two times that the North Vietnamese launched offensive into South Vietnam, they were held back by the U.S. and by the ARVN. The first time was the Tet Offensive. We all kind of understand, one of the biggest moments of the Vietnam War. And in the Tet Offensive, the North launched an attack with 84,000 personnel. They lost 40,000 personnel in that fight. The Viet Cong, which I'll kind of talk about this for a minute too. You have pretty much two different groups that work for the North Vietnamese. You had the NVA, which was the North Vietnamese Army. That was the regular Army Combat Corps. And then you had the Viet Cong, which were guerrilla-type forces, usually operating. There were farmers. There were pretty much anybody who believed in the communist ideology, who were trying to just unite the North and the South. The Viet Cong basically was effectively destroyed during the Tet Offensive. They suffered such big losses to their command structure and to their combat effectiveness, they barely could even function anymore after that. Then again, you saw the Easter Offensive in 1973. Again, the North launches an attack with the aid of U.S. support. The ARVN was able to push back the attack. And I think all that we really needed to have done is to continue to have give them logistical support. If we continue to give them our air power and our naval support, and to give them armament, artillery shells, ammunition, they could have successfully protected and defended their state. But we did not do that. There was a point where people were just tired of all the money. They were tired of the war. They didn't want anything to do with it. And it's sad, because we we were there. We believed in the state. We did so much to help them, and then we just turned our backs on them. And to me, it's one of the saddest moments in American history with the fall of Saigon, because it just really undid everything we fought and we worked so long for to try to give them. And this documentary is just fascinating. I couldn't recommend it enough. The Vietnam War is such an interesting topic of conversation and history, because to be honest, it's not that far removed, and it really symbolizes and it marks a moment in history where wars were never the same. We really have never seen a war since then where it's two nations with waving flags and going at it against each other. There hasn't been that conventional type of war since that time. We really have just seen splinter groups or guerrilla fighters taking up a cause against something. And it just really changed the way we look at warfare. It's changed the way the U.S. military has operated since that time. The Vietnam War it didn't just change the way things work in this country from a military standpoint, but just from a political standpoint and everything else. And all the content you can get on this, I'm a junkie for it. I love it, and usually only talk about sports, but this was one of those documentaries that I felt like it was worth to talk about, and I couldn't recommend it more. It was excellent, and I might even watch it again in these next couple of days, but I would say I couldn't recommend it enough. It's very good, and definitely something that I'm always ready for a conversation for. So thank you for staying tuned to this. We will be back in a minute finishing it off with sports. What else would we finish with? So stay with us, and we will be right back.